Good morning.
Morning, how are you?
Okay. Interesting um, overall state, but I'm here.
Okay,
How are you all?
I'm doing pretty well. Hello, Trevor.
Good morning. How are
Morning.
you?
All right,
Glad to hear it.
good. So we had one meeting on administrative matters yesterday. So we talked actually about the things we're doing for active inference um, symposium. So this is coming up in November, and we're responsible for actually multiple things. The first is this cybernetics talk, and Jesse prepared a wonderful Medium post, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And as well as, we had a discussion about, we had a discussion originally about this paper on purpose. I can't remember the name of it. Purpose, behavior, and teleology, I believe. And this is a classic cybernetics paper from Rosenbluth et al., where they lay out this idea of teleology. So we're exploring that in the context of more modern work, the history of science, the history of cybernetics, as well as the history of complexity theory and kind of how those come together. So this is shaping up to be a pretty good talk, I think. We'll go over the slides a little bit today and discuss that. We also talked about the open source and open science lectures that we're going to sponsor and present. So we're doing that sort of offline. We're doing that we're doing the cybernetics talk offline. It's going to be like it's going to be like asynchronous, and then we're going to maybe do one or two talks, or maybe three, that are asynchronous on open science and open source, and then there's going to be a talk that someone from the outside gives, that Morgan's trying to set up, and that'll be around an hour. So that'll be like live with questions, and hopefully that works out. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get our work in front of a bigger audience, and we're trying to get people in that organization familiar with open science and open source, especially in the context of what we've been doing in our interest group. So that's something that we're working on. And for the asynchronous talks, we have till November 10th. And for the live stream talk, we have until I guess it's a couple days later, because the event is the 13th through the 15th. So that was our week. We didn't have our deworm because, well, for one thing, we have a number of collaborators in Canada, and it was Canadian Thanksgiving, so we didn't have the session. We're going to have a meeting this coming week, and so I don't know what the topics will be yet. I'll have to figure that out over the weekend. Anyways, I have some announcements. The first one is that our Medium is very active right now. We have two posts this week. One from Pakhi Banchalia, who was one of our GSOC interns for DevoWorm, and then Jesse, of course, who is one of our heavy hitters in the area of cybernetics. So the first one is Pakhi Banchalia's post on her GSOC project. This is developing adaptive neural networks, growing graphs for dynamic data representation. So this is the stuff she did over the summer. It involves a couple of forked repos, one on topological data analysis and its visualization. So there's that aspect, and then there's this Devo graph, or there's this thing called neural developmental programs, which has actually been developed over in the artificial life community. And so the idea is to train a model with data. And then from that trained data, you reconstruct a network. So, she was able to reconstruct an embryo network, meaning that as cells divide in an embryo and they're going to move to a position, we can track that and set up a network topology to show what that network topology looks like. And so the network that we're using is a distance-based network, but you can use other types of criterion, such as chemical signaling and other types of criterion. So this is her project overview. She implemented a topological data analysis using K-mapper, and then this allowed her to sort of extract these complex data structures, and then being able to visualize a graph neural network as it's growing from a single node to a bunch of nodes. So we explored K-mapper, I think it was last year, with Himanshu Shogul, and he, kind of implemented the first steps of this, where he was able to get some visualizations, and Pakhi picked that up and continued on with that. So the K-mapper implementation is this way to take data and plot it out in a visualization that represents the shape of the data. So this is a sample visualization. Actually, there's a Mathematica applet that you can use to sort of visualize these. And so basically, this is the graph as it's sort of displayed in terms of topological data analysis. Now, what we usually get in topological data analysis is we usually look for shapes of different types. So you can take a network and you can plot it out, and you can get these kind of shapes. And this is not the same as sort of producing an sort of a visualization of a network. This is actually trying to find the shape. So, like sometimes in complex networks, in some of the packages that exist, you have different options for laying out a network. It could be a circular network, it could be like a force directed network, and so forth. That's not what this is. This is actually something where you're generating different shapes of the data, whether it has an elongation or whether it has like a circular aspect or whatever. And you can use that to, basically use topological methods to analyze the data. It doesn't have to be a network. It could be like a plot of independent data points. But the idea is that you're taking these data and you're finding some shape in it. So that was the first step. So this is this K-mapper algorithm, and that was, I don't know, she hasn't gotten a long ways on that, but that was something that was needed to happen, at least for the initial stages of this project. I don't know where we would go with this, actually. I'm thinking maybe we could go, in the direction of actually implementing formal topological analyses and getting numbers and saying something about the embryo. I know people have written papers on, say, the connectome in topology, but I don't know how much there is to say about that. In any case, that's that we haven't developed that to, I guess, where maybe its potential lies. The second part of the project is this growing graph neural networks. So this is where, you start with a single node, you add nodes as the cells divide, and those nodes then are connected, and they form this graph topology that is maybe interpretable in different ways. You can, say, for example, use graph statistics to calculate different aspects of the graph. You can describe the graph using different layouts, visual layouts. You can, you can decompose the graph and look at different parts of the graph, like cliques or modules and things like that. So, this was a fork of a repository on these neural developmental programs, and it required, on her part, first of all, to retrain the model, because the model was trained on data that was not C. elegans. And so she had to retrain the model. We used a standard data set that the DevoWorm group has. And then we had this sort of method for kind of determining the spatial graph neural networks. So the first point here is that there was temporal node addition. So in this case, we have nodes that are added over time. So as a cell divides at a certain time, you add a node. And you keep doing this over time. In any one case where a cell divides, the number of nodes is doubled, as well as having a connection between them and a distance, which is sort of where you can then visualize how those diverge. So in temporal node addition, the graph reads from a data set that includes birth times for each node. Nodes are dynamically added to the graph at their specified birth times. This process simulates cell division, where parent cells give rise to daughter cells at specific temporal points. Then in terms of the algorithm, it's doing the spatial learning. So it's actually doing this, plotting things out in terms of this graph, but then also learning the spatial relationships between nodes so that the newly added daughter cells are positioned correctly within the graph structure. And so there's this algorithm, the CMAES algorithm, which is actually an evolutionary algorithm. And this is the code here in Python, where you have basically it's making a copy of the cell, and it's implementing a loss function, and you're getting this sort of optimization procedure. And then there's this biological analogy. So we're building these graphs here that are supposed to represent the C. elegans embryo. It's not, doesn't lead to a fully formed sort of larval, when you end the embryogenetic process, basically the worm hatches out of its egg and it becomes an L1 larva. Now, we don't get up to that point with this simulation right now. It was trained up to about 150 cells, and she had problems with her GPU resources beyond that. So the infrastructure is here, but we just need more computational power to realize the full capacity of this. So there were a lot of things here. There's a point here I found interesting. When you're growing these GNNs, there's this limit of backpropagation. So standard backpropagation, a key component of neural network training, proved inadequate for the growing GNN. The increasing number of parameters as the network grew made traditional backpropagation ineffective. The nonlinear growth pattern of the network further complicated the use of gradient-based optimization methods. So that was an interesting finding. There are a bunch of future directions. The first one is that you can apply growing graph neural networks to other dynamic graph problems in developmental biology. There are all sorts of issues surrounding the growth of tissues, the growth of organisms that aren't embryos, the growth of or sort of the repair of tissues or the reorganization of tissues during different types of transformational processes, like metamorphosis. So these are all things that we could apply this method to. This K-mapper visualization, when you implement it at different time points throughout the graph, the growth process creates a series of topological snapshots of the network structures that evolves over time. As you saw in that graph, for the K-mapper graph that I showed, we have this sort of connectivity, but it's usually the connectivity isn't like represented it's very abstract. In complex network theory, graph topologies are usually very abstract from the problem. And so we want to sort of maybe link that graph more closely, especially in this case, to the embryo structure. So we want to know, like, for example, if there's some process in the anterior pole or the posterior pole, or the right side or left side that is changing in the network. And you can't necessarily do that if you plot it as a circle or you plot it sort of with a force-directed method. So this actually may allow you to look at maybe some of this fundamental structure of the embryo and get at that. You can also combine some of this with reinforcement learning. You can optimize for GPU acceleration, and that's where we're having this computational bottleneck. And you can also explore self-optimizing neural architectures. In fact, the way that neurodevelopmental programs are implemented. That's kind of what they're trying to do. They're trying to find these self-optimizing neural architectures. So that's the first Medium post. So congratulations to Pakhi on completing GSOC for this year. And we'll be following up on that maybe with a paper and some other things. So I hope to, kind of follow up on that maybe next year's GSOC as well in DivaWork. If we can follow up on this work, it would be great because we've been doing this for a couple of years now for the graph neural networks. We have this larger sort of initiative of developmental graph neural networks, or DGNNs. And so we've been working on that for, I think, the last 2 or 3 years. So that's something that we will be pursuing more. But we really want to push that. So we'll see where that goes. The second one, of course, is Jesse's post on behavior, purpose, and teleology. So I had the name wrong before. Enduring Insights from a Cybernetics Classic. So this is a deep dive into the 1943 paper by Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow, its historical context, and its continuing contributions to the philosophy of science, diverse intelligences, cognitive science, and other disciplines. So this is actually the figure that we were focusing on in both this post and in this presentation to active inference. And so we have this sort of behavioral typology where we look at behavior, and behavior is defined, I guess, as animal behavior, or it could be an artificial system behavior like an AI. And this is like 80 to 85 years old. This work, so it's about 80 years old. So there's a lot of neuroscience between then and now. There's a lot of work in artificial intelligence, a lot of other stuff as well. But I think they've kind of gotten this. They did a pretty good job, I think, of like kind of unpacking what's going on here. So behavior is divided into active and non-active components. And the active, so each of these is like the category that they're interested in. And then there's a non-category that is there. So we have active and non-active. An active behavior, which is like, goal-directed behavior we think of versus maybe something like habits. Which I don't know if that's the best way to think about it, but that's kind of the way it falls out. Because goal-directed behavior then is either purposeful or non-purposeful. Then I guess you could say that maybe active behavior is both habits and goal-directed, and then goal-directed is purposeful and habits are non-purposeful. But of course, then if non-purposeful is random, then that doesn't really include habits. So we have to kind of map our sort of concepts in neuroscience and psychology to this in some useful way. But this is basically coming out of this early cybernetics period. So it's very, very generalized. And then when we have purposeful behavior, we either have feedback-driven behavior, which is teleological, or non-feedback behavior, which is non-teleological. So teleology means doing something towards a goal, or having some driving force drive history or historical events. So if we have a series of behaviors that allow you to do something in the world, like drive a car or ride a bike, that could be considered to be teleological. It's driven by closed loop feedback, sometimes open loop feedback, but usually, a lot of times we think of it as closed loop feedback. And there's this sort of goal that's happening. So it's like it's not an open process. It's not an open-ended process. It's this closed process where you're having these, you're able to drive towards a goal. So that's what they mean by feedback or teleological versus non-teleological. Then for feedback teleological, you have predictive and non-predictive behaviors. Predictive being extrapolative and non-predictive being non-extrapolative. And then within predictive, there are these first, second, and third orders of prediction. So that's like higher order prediction. So you can think of that as like, if you can predict what's right in front of you, or the next event in a sequence, that's prediction. Second and third order are things that happen maybe as the summary of like 100 events ahead of you. If you can predict like 100 chess moves ahead, but then average it out and, kind of make it for a useful heuristic for playing chess. That would be like that sort of higher order prediction. So this is really good. And Jesse, I think, does an excellent job of kind of unpacking this and going through a lot of things here, and kind of thinking about the motivations behind this, looking for it, kind of looking at this in terms of a lens of analysis across natural and artificial agents. So, we have like this goal of sort of having this framework for analyzing artificial intelligence. In fact, we have a goal for maybe have a goal for analyzing different types of systems level behavior, human behavior, animal behavior, or whatever. And this is, a way to do this. So this is an old model, but it's definitely still useful. So yeah, and then of course we have a couple of assertions in the paper. We have behavior versus function, and then we have purposeful behavior being voluntary. So this behavior versus function, we have this distinction between sort of behavioral analysis and functional analysis, and kind of thinking about that in the context of the 1940s, which is maybe not like the contemporary way of thinking about it, but this is of course when behaviorism was sort of the hallmark of psychological research. Cognitivism hasn't really appeared on the scene yet. So that's the historical context. And then, of course, there's this different type of approach. So that's an interesting thing to bring up. Then also that teleology is purpose controlled by negative feedback. So, we think of like purpose being like behavior doing something in the world. It's almost functional. But then teleology is where that is controlled or maybe mediated by negative feedback. So if something is produced, we're always producing this this forward behavior, this feed forward behavior. It's going to have to be regulated. And so we're going to talk later about the hippocampus and the development of the hippocampus. And in the hippocampus, you generate these movement behaviors, these timed movement behaviors. And so it requires a lot of feedback to generate this. One of the things it requires is to sort of dampen the output, because if you're moving your arm or you're doing some controlled movement, playing a violin, you're going to have to control your movements. To do that, you need to have this negative feedback. Positive feedback will actually do the opposite of what you might intend in a skilled task, which is to overproduce movements and you'd have these jerky movements. In fact, you see these kind of spastic movements in movement disorders. And that's one of the problems in the hippocampus is it doesn't regulate the movement correctly. It doesn't implement this negative feedback. So this is, again, using these terms, teleology and purpose, as ways to sort of understand what's going on with the generation of behavior. Now, it's interesting, teleology is actually kind of a loaded word in science, in the history of science. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Purpose as well, because it's like obviously purpose is something I could just describe to something, and I don't really know. I could say something has a purpose, and it may not have a purpose, say evolutionarily, or it may not have a purpose in development, but we're ascribing a purpose to it anyways. So there's some problems with these terms and the terminology that, again, because it's from the 1940s, that's, it's a little bit, you need to unpack it, and it's important. But anyways, then Jesse includes a nice screenshot of his whiteboard as usual. He has this sort of his notes here. So that's good. And then just kind of talking about some of the, future things, like so on future engineering, grouping machines and organisms together, and AGRT. So this is where he talks about sort of this continuum between organismal behavior and machine behavior and how we can think about this. And of course, the early cyberneticists didn't have the kind of AI we have today, but they did think about automation and machines. And so this is an important thing. And it may be still pretty useful for like AI and analyzing AI. And then of course, thinking about the regulator theorem, where we're thinking about like how things are well regulated, as they say. So citing going back to the Evergood regulator paper by Conan and Ashby and talking about that and thinking about it. So definitely good stuff. And then he has some sort of an annotated bibliography here of different people. So Margaret Bowden, who wrote this book, Mind is Machine, History of Cognitive Science. Thomas Fuchs, who wrote Ecology of the Brain. Talks about a little bit about Valentino Breitenberg and Breitenberg vehicles, which is actually something that you could very easily stick into this and analyze Breitenberg vehicles using this typology. We don't do that directly, and maybe we're not really ready for that, but it's maybe an area for future research. Mike Levin, who of course does a lot of things in sort of diverse intelligences and maybe this sort of area. He's kind of nibbles on the edges of this area with his different frameworks. And then David Krakauer, who actually I think his work was the inspiration for this whole exercise, thinking about this in terms of complexity theory. And
it was in part like seeing Krakauer's seeing you mention Krakauer and taking a deeper dive into some of his work, which I still don't really. I'm still in the process of figuring out what that is, but that, and then constantly seeing, like I just posted one screenshot, but constantly seeing like Levin kind of references in some of the talks, many talks, but those ones that I've been looking at in particular. It's been this sort of I'm basically trying to explore what is in the space between this paper, Levin's work, and David Krakauer's work. Like there's things that make a lot of sense and overlap strongly, some that don't. And I want to explore some of that more in the future. So yes, and thank you for kind of the nudge in that direction, I guess, from the really good talks on this that you've been having here. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I think there are a lot of connections. Again, like there's a lot of unexplored area here. If you think about this as like nobody cares about the history of science when they talk about these things, that might be a better way of putting it. Like, I mean, I know that Krakauer does, but like we talked about this yesterday, where there's like people view it as kind of, especially if you're doing like the science part of it, quote unquote, you don't really want to get into the history, but you have to do this because, first of all, there's a lot of stuff that people kind of thought about, 50 or 100 years ago that might be relevant to what you're doing, and you need to update it and everything. But also, this is kind of a intellectual trajectory, right? Like these things kind of have led to other things in the more modern era that have we don't know why they people think the way they do about things, and this kind of predicts retroactively what that is. So yeah, I'm going to move to the slides. So this is like sort of the slides for our talk to act. If I'm not going to go over all of them, but I want to hit a couple slides here. So this first one is a brief and selective history of teleology, where I assembled this from my own notes, from Jesse's notes, or from his blog post, from other things in the talk here. So this is kind of going through from left to right. So in the Middle Ages, we start with teleology as divine causation. So this concept of teleology used to be used, to sort of say that there was some divine purpose in the universe. And there's something called scholasticism. And then eventually there was a sort of recasting of teleology as natural causation, for better or for worse. And that was Paley and Kant. So this is a philosopher, and then William Paley had the idea of the sort of the Paley's eye, which was where, he sort of advanced an argument for design of biological systems. This was pre-Darwin, so they wanted to explain biocomplexity in the world. So this was like early on, it's sort of the way they thought about teleology. Then you have the split between the vitalists of Bergson's time, which kind of, hung their hat on this sort of vital force. And then Darwin's work on evolution by natural selection. So evolution by natural selection is this historical thing that explains biocomplexity, and it has this naturalistic aspect to it. So it's very much, but it has its roots in some of these other earlier concepts. It's very much its own thing, though. And then Ernst Marr, who's a Darwinian who did, evolutionary biology, he thought of teleonomy as this sort of this difference between purpose and history. So you have historical systems or historical processes like evolution, and then you have purposeful processes, maybe like goal-directed behavior or something. So just kind of breaking that down in that stream. And then kind of independently, and I kind of make a break in the diagram. There are two streams that kind of come out of this, one anti-teleology and then one kind of pro-teleology. You start with Rosenbluth and Wiener, where they talk about teleology not as vitalism, but as feedback relative to a goal. So this is where we have, again, this, you're working towards a goal that's defined. Of course, in evolution, we know that, we have these open-ended systems where there is no goal. It's just that you have evolution by natural selection. Things get selected for. There's also genetic drift, and that's how you get things in the world. That's how you get biodiversity. In cybernetics, you have this feedback relative to a goal where there's an explicit goal that needs to be met, and then there's feedback that drives this system towards the goal. And this leads, of course, to goal-directed behavior and the way it's conceived of in cognitive science and reinforcement learning. And that's led to a couple of things like the molecular vitalism of Kirshner and Gerhardt, and the TAME and UAL frameworks of Levin, Jablonka, and Ginsburg. And then on the top is sort of thinking about behavior as habit. This is William James and Thorndike. Then we have Francis Crick, and he, of course, he was the person, one of the people who discovered the double helix, and he was very much, wanted to take all teleology out of molecular biology, as it wasn't, appropriate to describe what was going on there. So that's, that, and then of course we have this idea of feedback as complexity, which you see in control theory and dynamical systems. You don't really see, you may have a goal, or an optimization point. But especially with dynamical systems, you often just have dynamics, and that's what you have. That's a nice diagram, but I put these names. These names are in the talk, so that's it's not disconnected from the talk. I have this behavioral classification that we saw in Jesse's post. Basically, in the talk, one of the things that happens is that this behavioral classification gets shifted around, where things get exchanged out of this, out of the typical sort of Rosenbluth et al. Framework. This is our behavioral classification as it's stated in Rosenbluth et al. And then this is kind of the way we kind of think we can reconstruct this. So we can actually, in this case, take prediction and non-prediction and flip them. So if we flip prediction and non-prediction, we actually have prediction as the non-class and non-prediction as the class. And non-prediction leads not to orders of prediction, but orders of complexity. Furthermore, we can go and we can look at this as this breakdown of the category as dynamics versus prediction. So we take out non-prediction and we put in dynamics, and then we could say it's the order of dynamics being recurrence, prediction being extrapolation, non-prediction being extrapolation, and both leading to order of complexity, which may be a little bit different in terms of how those dynamics play out. Okay, so that's that. And then the other thing I wanted to point to here was this diagram here. So this is, now Jesse's been working on this idea of frontier maps. So frontier maps are these like maps of ideas or maps of references that kind of connect together. And you draw out a map and you can see sort of the lineage of an idea or the history of an idea very clearly. And so I like this idea. We've done this a number of times in the past. In this case, I took some data from this Krakauer book that we've been working on called The Complex World. So Jesse and I have this book and we're working through it. And this is where we're drawing a lot of our stuff about Rosenbluth as well. And in this frontier map, we have three related ideas. We have, of course, teleology and how it's been dealt with since 1943. We have organized complexity, and we have emergence. And so in Krakauer's book, he has these readings that he sort of highlights, and he gives them he sort of assesses where certain ideas are coming from, where they're continued on with, and so forth. So Rosenbluth 1943, for example, is this sort of the first mention of teleology in the modern literature in this area. And then that idea kind of gets passed down to these other later works. So Rosenbluth 1943 influences cybernetics and control, which was a work by Norbert Wiener in 1948. Then this gets passed on to a couple of works in 1962, Adaptive Systems by John Howland, and Organizations and Complexity by Simon, also in 1962. That gets passed down then to the Good Regulator paper in 1970. That further gets passed down to Order and Chaos from 1993. That was Kaufman. And then there's another separate link here between Rosenbluth and this TAME framework by Levin in 2022. But then if it just stopped there, that would be, interesting. But then we have these other associated ideas. So there's also organized complexity, which comes a little bit later. That comes with the Organization and Complexity paper in 1962. And that influences both the Good Regulator theorem and the autopoiesis paper, the hallmark autopoiesis paper by Maturana and Varela. Then that leads to this dissipativity paper, which is laying out this idea of dissipative structures. So that's Prigogine and a co-author. And then this leads to Order and Chaos by Kaufman in 1993. And then that also influences TAME. And then, of course, the third one is Emergence, which is More is Different by Anderson, which is actually a paper that's sort of the hallmark of the Santa Fe Institute. They always talk about it. It's basically the first mention of emergent systems. And so, that's a good paper if you're interested in finding out more about sort of emergent systems and how people thought about it originally. But then that influenced autopoiesis, dissipativity, and Order and Chaos by Kaufman. So you can see these related concepts and how they kind of are influencing things together. So, this is, I think, an interesting point because, we think about this as old, stodgy, or stodgy cybernetics, history of cybernetics, but it's actually relevant to the modern world and in different ways that we wouldn't have thought previously. So that's all I want to go through with that. But there's a lot more in that talk, and we'll see that talk on our YouTube channel at some point. But yeah, I think we're doing pretty well in that area. So I don't know if we had any comments or questions on either of those Medium articles. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of stuff there. I'm quite excited to do this, like both the cybernetic stuff for the conference and where things are going. A lot of my, work from this week has been finishing that. And as I said, I think yesterday was another meeting. But part of the challenge of writing that essay was the ending could have turned into a lot of different things, and I'm glad we're kind of continuing. It's a nice dovetail into what's happening at the actual event, that talk. But then in the future, there's a lot of different ways things could go. And the sort of bibliography part that I mentioned, for those who are like newer to the lab or just watching the videos or something, those are all the books that we talked about in that section, with I guess exception to Margaret Bowden's book, which is more about like a history. And I mentioned that just for sort of context, and we've kind of dived in and out of some of the things mentioned there, in cognition features and elsewhere. But like Fuchs, Breitenberg, a lot of Levin's work, and now Krakauer's work are sort of these, not really pillars, but these themes or ideas or people that have just come up, and it's sort of interesting. It's interesting to look back at where we've been in the lab and then where we might be going next through a lot of those lenses, because like for a long time there's been like reimagining cybernetics as this concept of a project, and it's maybe more of a theme than a project in some ways, but now we're kind of had this turn to, okay, like there's a lot of dovetails of reiterating things back into up through like developmental brain vehicles, some of the meta brain stuff, and going into like complexity, going into what we're going to be talking about at the event too. So it's just exciting to put that together, and it's sort of, I don't know, it's been interesting to do it and to sort of build the current vantage point on that front. Also, there's some things about Frontier Map. I think I might actually mention them in Slack because it'll be easier to type about. But it's nice to kind of see that again. Originally Frontier Map, which I think I should just make it a preprint fully and publish it. But basically it's it wasn't about a map or like a mind map. It was about going through historical context and developments and structures and fields, which may lead into a physical like map at the end. And I feel like that's I think there's some new uses for it that I'd like to talk more about too. But yeah, as this is part update and part reflection of things now, but like this week and since yesterday, I've been thinking a bit more about both of those projects, sort of the complexity related teleology, complexity, Krakauer bridge of thing is something that I am kind of writing up a little proposal for. I've actually already, I have one internally, like there's sort of a Joe Pro project on that I'm not sure if I'm gonna, it's a little bit too, like it's not, there's a version of the project that's not really, it's more like an internal project than anything for other people to do. But I think there might be some things that would be like, if people are interested in that, like we could go through the book and stuff like that for sure. Like, which is, there's a lot of the Santa Fe Institute has like their foundational series of papers on complexity, and then Krakauer's book's a little more, I don't know, I guess it's sort of derived from that, but then he's also kind of expressing his perspective, I guess. But there's sort of a complexity related set of projects. And what I'm intrigued about with that is also there might be some people from some other, I guess, groups or universities that might be interested in doing some things there too. So I guess stay tuned on that front. And yeah, I had a few other comments about the open source event, but I don't know if now's a good time to talk about that too.
We could talk about that.
Basically, I'm just intrigued by, and people are interested in contributing to this, they can. I might try to make a sort of not really call for, I guess, call for involvement, or like call for, like, if you want to collaborate on this a little bit, just because I think there's at least two things I would like to make for. It's sort of like we're making this asynchronous buffet. People could just like come by and check out what they want. So at the Active Inference Symposium event that's happening in November, we have an actual presentation talk that Bradley's doing about the paper and the slides, I guess, presentation. And then there's also sort of a asynchronous open source, I don't really know what to call it, a set of presentations or potential talks we made of some speakers and things like this come in and have this sort of a lot of some materials, some discussions, some talks, I guess. But there's this big asynchronous component where you can just make stuff if you want to talk about it. Bradley's, I believe, doing kind of an overview of a few, open source things. But there were a few things specifically on my mind that I want to do a smaller presentation of some sort about. One of them is we've had a really long theme of the project management, open source project management, things we talk about on the Friday meetings, or at least did in the summer, like open source and like managing through open source career, or like how do you, maybe a better way to say it is professional development topics as well. So both managing in open source project management kind of a sense, open source leading open source research, but also participating in it and also participating in those kind of like career related skills and whatnot. That's one of them. And then secondly, I've been thinking about something along the lines of data ethics, potentially data management, and how to go about I'll just say data ethics and somewhat data management, and I have some new ideas about that too. So I'm going to refine those. I'm refining those ideas a little bit, and I think I'll basically just put some like calls for potential involvement if any of those topics. It's a broad topic of data science, but more so ethics and data management too, I suppose. In particular in the context that might be relevant to open source stuff and maybe some of the bigger things in the active interest institute, just quite a lot of stuff. So that's on my mind, and I will. I'm working on those over the weekend. So,
yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, that's kind of what we want to do, and we've also kind of this open source, open science part of this participation also builds upon our open house channel. I know we've forgotten about that, but we have a YouTube playlist where we have the open house materials where we've talked about like the different projects. And I haven't given an update for this year, but the material is still on YouTube, so it's like it's still, I think, a good summary of where we've been. So this is kind of an opportunity for us to add to that, but also to stake out new ground in this area. So good. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Jesse, for that. I don't know if Trevor or Morgan had any updates they wanted to share with us before we move on.
I don't have anything too much. I was looking over at the articles as you all have been talking, and I said a few thoughts. I was just trying to contextualize everything, but I guess I just hindsight is 2020, right? So I'm just looking at some of these things, and in the context of like current seemingly AI agendas, and one of the things that like wasn't clear to me is like would planning be considered like prediction in this framework?
Yeah, I think it would. And I think planning, so it's kind of planning is teleological because there's a goal. You're trying to plan for something, trying to optimize your plans. But also, it's maybe a little bit more open ended, so maybe it's not teleological. And then, of course, it's goal oriented. So you have this goal, that you want to achieve, and then there's this prediction. So once you plan out things, you can predict. Where basically how planning works is you plan for things, and then you kind of predict the next step, and you're successful, and you move on to the next step. So it's like assembling a Jenga or working with a Jenga tower. You have to predict what the consequence of moving the wrong piece is, or moving the right piece. So I think there's this that's the thing. It'd be interesting if someone took that typology and kind of put different actual things from cognitive science in it. So like planning or some sort of cognitive behavior, like attention, which isn't really kind of what we would think there, but it might, what's going on there? Does that fit into this framework? Or good old fashioned reinforcement learning?
I like it. The other thing I was just curious about is I noticed there's some discussion of like voluntary and I was just curious if there's just any more thoughts on like how voluntary is like described. It seems a little bit touching on like free will type of stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, we have like in cognitive science, we think of things as being goal directed. So they're interested mainly in these kind of goal directed behaviors, planning, that sort of thing. But of course, you have reflexive behaviors. You have voluntary, you have involuntary reflexes, you have voluntary movements, things like that. So, to kind of map things to this framework, you have to have this sort of breakdown of the kinds of behaviors you're interested in and how they fit into the framework. There's a sort of touches a little bit on free will because, we think about I guess maybe the problem with the free will debate is that we haven't thought about it. And, we think about it in terms of specific behaviors. So if we have an example of free will, it might be like motor planning or motor control. That's like the Wee-Bey experiment where, you move your arm and there's a precursor in the, there's an ERP that kind of predicts that. And, there's been a lot of interpretation around that. But to think of that, these different behaviors as having these different aspects to them, might clarify the free will argument a little bit, but then again, it might make it worse. I don't know. I've always been like kind of skeptical of the free will debates because it's kind of like, it just kind of goes off in many directions. And so, yeah, but it does have that aspect to it.
I think it's super interesting, and especially for someone like me that's really ignorant, it's nice to get the historical overview of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's good. I don't know, Morgan, did you have anything?
Yeah, excuse me. Sorry, I'm still under the weather after these
Oh yeah.
these shots. It's been brutal. I've just been underneath a blanket and eating soup. No, I think I've said it before. Teleology is it's one of those areas of philosophy that just will not refuses to be systematized.
Yeah.
It resists, and perhaps like Trevor's saying, is caught up in other Kevin Mitchell like free will debates when pushed into again areas we don't necessarily like to go.
Right.
But
I think Kevin Mitchell actually, I posted it somewhere. I think he just commented on it earlier today.
Commented on what?
He said, nice article, always nice to reread the cybernetics work, but I'm not sure if it's the same one. I think it might be that you're talking about.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, you know, I love, I've just been really enjoying Sapolsky's, what does he call it? Father Offspring podcast.
Yeah.
So he's doing a podcast with his daughter.
Oh, okay.
And she's kind of hosting it and asking viewer questions. And it's anyway, Sapolsky being the anti-Mitchell, you know, but at the same time, you know, like yeah, just but a very deep, you know, like with a profound understanding of sciences and brain science in particular. Anyway, I love the discussion, and I really want to spend more time with it. I just haven't. Yeah.
I think for me, I guess I'll say it this way. My disclosure is like I'm kind of I'm gonna say something inarticulately, and I'm just gonna confess, like I'm just gonna be really not nuanced, and maybe I should be, but I'm just not gonna be. Basically, I don't like like I'm like not interested in discussions of free will. Like I don't care. That's not entirely true, but for the sake of like getting to my other point, I'm just gonna say that right now. Like I don't find it to be interesting, I guess. But what I really want to say is, to my part of why this has been so interesting to me, and I'm like, is this like really understanding this paper's trying, like the original paper trying to craft out, like carve away, like from the immense I don't want to say stigma, but maybe stigma, but like teleology is a very complicated topic and a very, very messy one. And I like agree it's not really going away, and just seeing I think I've sort of almost been naive or like joyfully ignorant about not getting into some of the stuff. And but like what teleology is sort of what the paper, I should say, what this paper, the 1943 paper was, why it's like renewed or like I've seen it before. I think we've talked about it like many times, like since I've ever been in the lab, it's come up, you know, it's always been referenced to stuff like that. I think we even read it before or something like that. But why it's exciting for me this time around is because being able to trace the evolution of the teleological debate, like I was actually more curious to read what Kant was trying to say. I've had no particular interest to read a lot of classic philosophy. I know stuff that I deal with, but like I don't like David Krakauer. I feel like is someone who's like, oh yeah, like really gets into the history in a way that I don't know if I ever will, and that's all cool. But there's a sense of carving away from just like I looked last night at like a Carl Sagan book. I forget if it was like The Demon Haunted World or something like that, and Sagan's very like, you know, big picture and humanity and be good to people and all this stuff. And he, you know, he's very also anti mystical, etc. And in his book, he only spoke about like reductionism in against you know, mystical takes on it. So it's this interesting. What I guess going back to what my like one of the curious things for me is seeing this effort to kind of scrape away from, you know, like the reductionist scientific masculinistic view that was doing important work at the time, but then really like I appreciate how much effort the authors went into saying like, look, like, and this is like I'm trying to put myself like before cybernetics even existed. which is still somewhat outdated now in some ways or whatever. Like trying to scrape away from this teleological backlash to say this, and it's kind of interesting to see. Like I'm not that familiar with like teleonomy or these other things that are trying to get away from. It's sort of like this effort to dance around this topic, and then what do you want to get away? What do you want to take away from it? And how can it be useful to maybe in this case try to classify, behaviors of 8 different agents? Can you look at from the lens of purposeful behavior as it's defined? What can you take away from that? And I just find it to be. I think I just have a renewed sympathy for that kind of work too, because they're sort of reclaiming different topics and putting them in new lights that I feel like is a space that I seem to be much more interested in than a lot of other people. And it's like, how do you do that the right way? So there's kind of some tips and some sympathy for the efforts and how hard it is to do that. Sorry, I just have a phone call, so I'll step away for a second.
All right, well, that's good. Well, that's enough there to get some pretty good discussion. So thank you. You want to say something, Morgan?
Well, just to also kind of support Jesse's, like, if my preference is always to avoid questions of free will. like consciousness, where it's just like it's much more interesting to look at anesthesia and things like that than than it is to look at say meditation or again kind of self-induced alterations of consciousness, for instance. And some of that is methodological and some of that is philosophical, but anyway, but like I understand that desire to avoid it. I just think it's interesting, that eventually these things always come back, and sometimes our best attempts to run from them, we actually run towards them.
All right, so that's all I think on that stuff. Let's move on to so speaking of cybernetics, I've been looking at Maxim Raginsky's Substack. And of course, we've talked about Maxim Raginsky before. He does a lot of control theory stuff, but also philosophy of control theory and philosophy of, I guess, cognition, cybernetics in that area. So it's, kind of related to this stuff. And, also AI, because, of course, there's this emphasis now on sort of, I guess, part of cybernetics went towards modern AI. So this is kind of, I'm going to go over a couple of posts from him and we'll talk a little bit about this. I found these really interesting posts. So he just read this book, The Design of Inquiring Systems by C. West Churchman. And so this is this book here, Basic Concepts of Systems and Organization. This is C. West Churchman, who was an American philosopher and systems scientist who was a professor in business administration and peace and conflict studies at the University of California, Berkeley. So that's kind of an interesting 2 areas to be in. Churchman edited the Journal of Philosophy of Science for a long period beginning in 1948. Has been cited by Noam Chomsky as the only professor for whom he learned anything as an undergraduate. And European students of West Churchman are Werner Ulrich and Christo Ivanov, who developed his work in related fields and contributed to its diffusion in Europe. So what is his area, I guess, is the question. And so Churchman made significant contributions in the fields of management science, operations research, and systems theory. So it sounds like he was a good old-fashioned cybernetics person who maybe isn't called a cybernetics person, but whatever. So he, was did work across the vast range of topics, including accounting, research and development management, city planning, education, mental health, space exploration, and peace and conflict studies. That is a lot of stuff. So this is kind of, one of the things he's known for is this idea of incorporating ethical values into operating systems. So that was one of his areas. So that's C.W.S. Churchman, and this is the Design of Inquiring Systems. This was published in 1971, examining the problem of designing automated systems that conduct inquiry. So this is kind of like, some of the things we've talked about with AIs and, with generating hypotheses with different sorts of artificial intelligence and other things like that. And so the author defines inquiry as an activity which produces knowledge. From the viewpoint of epistemology, cybernetics, or more properly general systems theory and artificial intelligence. So this again is like sort of really early thinking about, AIs and sort of thinking about these automated systems and thinking about the ethics of them and all that. So it's really kind of an early stab at like AI ethics, way before it was like relevant or, but this is, so given when this book was written, artificial intelligence was firmly grounded in the symbolic information processing paradigm. So this is back in the days of GoFi, where you had these rule-based systems or these symbolic information systems. But, these questions that it raises take on new relevance given the proliferation of large language models. So, again, we had the kind of AI we had back then. Of course, there were a lot of ethical issues that one could raise, and so those ethical issues are still relevant, especially when you're trying to do things like generate words and sentences and things that people interact with and produce knowledge, basically. Another interesting aspect of this book is the way Churchman reinterprets the ideas of 17th century rationalists like Spinoza, Leibniz, and Descartes, empiricists such as Locke and Hume, German idealists such as Kant and Hegel, and American pragmatists like Dewey and Singer, using the systems theory framework. So he's using the systems theory framework to get at some philosophical points of view, some philosophical questions. So he gives a summary of key ideas, how this book makes contact with current developments in AI. So again, Churchman was a philosopher in a business school, which seems a bit strange, but they have a lot of interesting people in business schools. But it's so he has a certain point of view on things. Some of the cyberneticists, of course, were in management and business, so that doesn't come as a surprise. But this focus on ethics maybe is a surprise. But it gives this unique point of view, and so. Again, we can bring this forward into the present. And, it tells us something about some of these cultural technologies that we're developing, such as large language models and other types of, generative AI and things like that. The way Churchman described inquiring systems, it is a very broad concept that includes entities like universities, corporations, markets, the scientific enterprise as a whole, political arrangements, etc. All these complex assemblages produce knowledge in one way or another. In other words, it is convenient to think of Churchman's inquiring systems in the same vein as Alice and Gopnik's concept of cultural technologies, which she defines as tools that allow individuals to take advantage of vast amounts of collective knowledge and transmit and amplify the knowledge generated in this process. So like we know that Gordon Pask was a cyberneticist who worked in sort of these types of entities that are, large complex systems, but are also, sort of hard to apply a standard cybernetics framework to. So corporations, markets, universities, we talked, I think, about some of the things they did with CyberSyn and how, that was basically trying to control sort of a complex market or a complex system at the level of a nation state. And so this is the same type of thing we're doing here. And this whole category of inquiring systems is, sort of, these are things where you have, systems that interact with the world in different ways. And there's an interesting sort of fertile ground here to think about more. And then this idea of cultural technologies, which is, of course, credited to Alison Gopnik, but also Henry Farrell, who's applied this idea specifically to large language models and frames them as engines of cultural transmission, just like libraries and just like language itself. Cosma Shalizi, who's another complexity person, argues that one should view large language models as vast library catalogs. And of course, they're not just vast repositories of knowledge, but rather closer to complex assemblages like markets and bureaucracies. So there's this, kind of divide between kind of how we think maybe of AI as sort of this place where you train data, and more like this sort of system that is, maybe like a system of people where you have rules, but you also have people who do things and interact with the world. So in markets and bureaucracies, you have a storage of knowledge, but you also have active behavior that does things. Whereas in AIs, of course, you have training data, but you also have them interacting with the world and often shaping the world in different ways. So that's an interesting set of interesting discussion, I think, that could be unspooled into a new area, especially with respect to some of the stuff we're doing with AI ethics and the SET project. And so, yeah. In fact, the idea of libraries as depositories of knowledge is discussed by Churchman early on in the book. He takes a pragmatist inflected view, which has a lot in common with the ideas of Clarence Lewis. And so this is kind of talking about to conceive of knowledge as a collection of information seems to rob the concept of all its life. Knowledge is a vital force that makes an enormous difference in the world. Simply to say that it is a storage of sentences is to ignore all that this difference amounts to. Knowledge resides in the user and not in the collection. It is how the user reacts to a collection of information that matters. Hence, we should turn to the other concepts of knowledge, action and potential action. So this is where we're going to kind of get into how the constituents of a library or the constituents of a bureaucracy interact with the world and interact with that knowledge and apply that knowledge to the world. And then, kind of going through some more things here that are sort of more philosophically oriented. This is some interesting stuff on Leibniz, monads, fact nets, and internalism. And, this is kind of in the weeds stuff. I'm not really sure exactly where to go with that, but it's interesting reading about Locke's consensus. And then let's see, Kant, a priori as world model. Kind of going through that, talking about, I guess, some relevance to world modeling, as we know it maybe in AI, but also as sort of these conceptual schemas that you need to have to interpret the world. So this is interesting stuff here. So this is a really nice article. It gets into a lot of deep philosophy and, but, it might have some relevance to what we're doing. This other article here is Right Said Fredkin, which is a very 90s reference. But it's on Fredkin, who, of course, we talked about when we talked about physical computation. We talked about Fredkin as the person who designed the Fredkin gate, which is a type of quantum logic gate. I mean, we talked about Fredkin in our physical intelligence or the physical computation discussion. So you can go back to there to find some of those papers. But anyways, this is Right Said Fredkin, The Chronicles of AI Prophecy. So this is kind of talking about this book by Pamela McCorduck, which is Machines Who Think. This was published in 1979, and it talks about the state of AI right before the AI winter of the 1980s. So this is kind of talking about this period we talked about just previous, this sort of go-fi where you did a lot of things with rules and with semantics, and that was right before the AI winter of the 1980s. And then the end of the AI winter of the 1980s, we would get connectionism. We would get this sort of focus on sort of statistical models for AI. So there was a shift going on at the time. The book is steeped in the symbol processing or good old-fashioned AI paradigm, which is not surprising given both the time when it came out and the author's unprecedented access to all the key thinkers and researchers who are now indelibly associated with GoFi. So these include Herbert Simon, Alan Newell, Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy. And I think they were all at MIT or they were MIT adjacent. So that's another point. Many of the ideas, such as Simon's and Minsky's dismissal of learning, look rather quaint now. Along with the history of ideas, McCorduck's book exposes the human element and the human folly. So it's amusing to read about Simon, Newell, and others expressing their frustration with Hubert Dreyfus's philosophical critique of AI, and how his message has gotten amplified because of the Rand Corporation. And they released this memo on alchemy and artificial intelligence. In Alan Newell's words, the kind of platform Dreyfus was given to endow him with an authority and credibility he's simply not entitled to. So there was a lot of cattiness in this period of before 1980 in AI. So it's kind of interesting. So this is again the more interesting bits are at the end, where McCorduck is interviewing Ed Fredkin, a pioneer in both AI and reversible computing, who died earlier this year. We talked about Edward Fredkin again in previous meetings. I will now quote some of the passages in full, not because I necessarily agree with what he says, but because he prefigured many of the ideas and concerns we are now hearing from people like Jeff Hinton, but with more nuance and more cautious optimism. So this is, he was definitely maybe like an AI doomer before that became even a concept. So it's a kind of an interesting, and keep in mind Fredkin was saying these things in the 1970s. So this is a picture of Claude Shannon, John McCarthy, Ed Fredkin here in the yellow jacket, and then Joseph Weizenbaum. Of course, John McCarthy is one of the AI people we talked about earlier, and Claude Shannon is the sort of the founder or the father of information theory. So yeah, and so Fredkin, I guess, is, if you know anything, well, Jesse knows what the TESCREAL bundle is, but it's this idea that there's this ideology called TESCREAL, where people kind of think about AI, the potential of AI, sort of the potential for AI to take over the world, destroy humanity, and all of that is sort of this group of things that people believe. So it's interesting that this is sort of in this he's kind of thinking in this direction really early. On AI is the next step in evolution. Artificial intelligence is the next step in evolution, but it's a different step. And it's very different because the genetic message concept has disappeared with it. One artificially intelligent device can tell another not only everything it knows in the sense that a human teacher can tell a student, but it can tell another device everything about its own design. And so it's just kind of going on about how AI intersects with evolution and how it will take over biological evolution somehow. On the gap between human and advanced AI. And say there are two artificial intelligences, each about the size of a small table. When these machines want to talk to each other, my guess is they'll get right next to each other so they can have very wideband communication. You might recognize them as Sam and George, and you'll walk up and knock on Sam and say, "Hi, Sam. What are you talking about?" What Sam will undoubtedly answer is things in general, because there's no way for him to tell you. From the first knock until you finish the T in about, which is the end of that word, Sam probably will have said to George more utterances than have been uttered by all people who have ever lived all their lives. I suspect there will be very little communication between machines and humans, because unless the machines condescend to talk to us about something that interests us, we'll have no communication. And then on the danger coming from semi-intelligent machines, talking about, and again, this was well before modern AI. This was back in the GoFi era. So, he's talking about semi-intelligent programs that are these sort of expert systems. So you had these expert systems like Dendrol in the field of chemistry, or Mycin in the field of internal medical diagnosis, and maybe you can have other types of expert systems as well. But such a machine might be full of bugs. Such a limited expert could bring about catastrophes we aren't even able to cause ourselves, one we aren't smart enough to concoct. The danger is a temporary one, existing only when the machines are somewhat but not very intelligent. For the really intelligent ones will be able to understand our motives, what we want, and understand their own operations, and know that they're working towards solving the problems we want solved. So whereas the semi-intelligent ones will have no such introspection, will operate in ways that have nothing to do with our highest level goals. So what they're saying here is that you have these expert systems, and you could say, for example, have one that's very intelligent that could be able to have this sort of, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, theory of mind, where it can understand what the humans want and what the humans are doing in terms of motives. But the semi-intelligent machines don't have this introspection, and so in that sense, they're very dangerous and can't anticipate what humans want. A good way to think about this is if you remember the movie War Games, where the Whopper computer is trying to initiate a nuclear war without any regard for human ethics or human input. And so, this is something where, again, we say semi-intelligent as differentiated from intelligence. And so what differentiates that from intelligence? Apparently this sort of theory of mind where the machine knows what the human is thinking, communicating with the human, and so forth. But what's also interesting here is you do see some connections here with this typology that we were talking about earlier, where we had this typology of behavior. We go from, we decompose behavior into these different components ending with prediction. And so, these expert systems are very good at prediction, but maybe they need other components of this behavior as well. So if we go back to this, the behavioral typology, we see behavior, we have active, non-active, purposeful, non-purposeful. And we could actually fit in, say, like an AI's behavior into this and see, what exactly what's generating, how it's responding, and all that. Now, this behavioral classification or this typology doesn't include anything about ethics. So this is something also that maybe, if we start talking about ethics, we can fit in here as well. Ed Fredkin was a really interesting person. He was talking about a lot of these issues that people were talking about with respect to AI many, many years ago. And this is well before we had the sort of so-called intelligent machines that we have today. So the question is is this something that we've always thought about in AI? Or is this something that comes with a certain level of perceived intelligence of the machines? Or what do we have here? I think this is a really interesting article in that it reflects a lot upon a lot of this, goes through the history and talks about what people were thinking maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So yeah, here's Fredkin on the impossibility of the off switch and on the futility of an AI pause. Again, linking this to modern issues that people have been talking about. And, really kind of history repeating itself in a lot of ways. It's really interesting. So I don't know. Yeah, Morgan's smiling. He's maybe got some things to say.
Well, sorry, I had to step away. The dogs, but well, just the last part just reminds me of. It just reminds me a little of the history of psychiatry, where the same discussions kind of come back every 20 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I think that means that they're, well, I don't know. Yeah. But certainly it is really interesting. I think somebody, he'd put, substitute Chinese for Russians and it would be contemporary or something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly, there's this great YouTube channel, Asiametry. I forget. I'm not getting the name right, but it covers the semiconductor industry.
Okay.
Or for the most part, covers the semiconductor industry. But every so often, they'll have other topics, and it recently talked about what did they call it? The fifth wave of Japanese software. It's like, anyway, if you're my age, you can remember when the Japanese were going to be we're going to take over technology, take over the world, and anyway, there's just some discussions, but it's also interesting in an attempt to create, a government program attempting to create an AI boom. And let's just, short story, it failed.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, those discussions do seem like, like we just keep coming back to those, or is that more like how sci-fi just keeps going over the same themes again and again,
Yeah. There are a lot of tropes in.
Yeah, this is just our speculative bit, right?
Yeah. But I think that also gives us a lesson for how this might play out. Like the GoFi systems were thought to be like kind of the path to this super intelligence, but then it, of course, didn't do that. So why? And there's this sort of delta between like semi-intelligent and intelligent, as you saw. And it's like, okay, well, what is this? What fills that delta? Is it, something that we're going to get to by scaling systems up, or is it going to be something we do by something else, or never get there at all, or what are we talking
about? Certainly the AGI is only 10 years away.
Yeah.
Seems to be something that's said every 10 years or 2 years. Yeah.
Right.
I just, now that he's won Nobel Prize, Demis sorry. Anyway.
Yeah.
Google DeepMind, AGI 10 years away.
Yeah.
You heard it here, folks. Yeah. Like, okay. I don't know how you want to spend the next 10 years, but I'm pretty sure we'll be back here in 10 years.
Yeah.
Going like, so what do you think would be the fruitful routes for pursuing AGI?
Yeah, so I mean, that was interesting that was sort of, that was right before the AI winter of the 1980s. So this was this Machines Who Think book, and it kind of captures this history. But it was published in 1979, which is right before we actually go from that GoFi to the statistical methods. So it's kind of like right at like where, I don't know if it's like elegy or what's going on there, but you know. But anyways, it's just a nice historical thing, and again, it feeds into this idea that we can learn a lot from revisiting the history. So this is kind of a loose group of papers I'm calling projections, innervation, and development. So, this is going to talk about development, computational neurodevelopment, some things about cerebellar development, and the projections in the brain as they develop. So it's kind of an interesting area, like set of areas. So this first paper is calling The Growing Little Brain, and this is a paper on neurodevelopment. And so this is on the bioRxiv, and it talks about the cerebellum and how there's this functional development it's actually from cradle to school. So this is like in juveniles, and they do this fMRI study on, this cohort or this group of children from birth to 60 months. So this is kind of, maybe from age 0 to age 5. And so, this is looking at the sort of cerebellum and its crucial role in brain function. So we talked about the cerebellum as being this structure that is involved in a lot of behavioral smoothing, whether it be language, because it is involved in language production, or in movements, regulating movements, making sure that movements are smooth and not spastic, and some other things as well. So the structure of the cerebellum, the cellular structure, the structure of projections, are all sort of these sort of relays that enable the sort of negative feedback to regulate, the sort of the tempo or cadence of behavior. So despite the cerebellum's crucial role in brain functions, its early development, particularly in relation to the cerebellum, or the cerebrum, remains poorly understood. So there are connections between the cerebellum and the cortex and other structures in what we call a cerebrum. And so, these two things have to be coordinated, of course, in development. So we don't really understand them very well. Here we examine cerebellocortical connectivity. So this is where we have the connections between the cerebellum and the neocortex, which is, of course, important in a lot of cognition, because a lot of cognition, of course, happens in the neocortex, but it also involves other areas, like the thalamus and some other areas in the midbrain, and then, of course, the cerebellum. And so they're using over 1,000 high-quality resting state functional MRI scans of children from birth to 60 months. So it's a pretty large data set. By mapping cerebellar topography with fine temporal detail for the first time, we show the hierarchical and contralateral organization of cerebellocortical connectivity from birth. So this is where we have this sort of these different types of organization in the brain, kind of how those two things are connected. We observe dynamic shifts in cerebellar network gradients, which become more focal with age, while maintaining stable anchor points similar to adults. So this is where we have these network gradients, we have these dynamic shifts. They become more focal with age, but maintain stable anchor points. And this highlights the cerebellum's evolving yet stable role in functional integration during early development. So this is where, we could have a lot of change that disrupts function, but we don't. A lot of developmental change actually maintains function, but is highly shifting nonetheless. And so, I guess the shifting part of it, the addition and reduction of connections, is to refine function. So this is what they're observing here. Our findings provide the first evidence of cerebellar connections to higher order networks at birth, which generally strengthen with age, emphasizing the cerebellum's early role in cognitive processing beyond sensory and motor functions. So this is where, you're getting this sort of early development of these kind of sensory motor functions, but you're getting more than that. especially with respect to how it connects to the neocortex and other structures in the cerebrum. Our study provides insights into the early cerebellocortical interactions, reveals functional asymmetry and sexual dimorphism in cerebellar development, and lays the groundwork for future research on cerebellum-related disorders in children. So this is, this is of course, they talk about the cerebellocortical system, how it's important in human language, emotional regulation, attention control, cognition, and working memory. So there are a lot of functions here, as well as motor functions. And these diverse functions are believed to be the result from the cerebellum's interaction with the cerebrum, positioning the cerebellocortical system as one of the most crucial circuits in the brain. Evolutionary anthropologists suggest that brain expansion in primates, where you go from this neocortex that's relatively small in prosimians and in monkeys, and then there's a great expansion in apes, and culminating in the expansion of the brain in hominids, or the expansion of the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain in hominids. And the question is what kinds of things? First of all, we kind of speculate on why that's happened, but also how does that relate to the rest of the brain? And so this is driven by the selective modular expansion of the cerebellocortical system. So the cerebellum, even though it didn't expand in apes and in primates more generally, it has, it's still kind of a key part of this expansion, even indirectly related to it. Notably, compared to other primates, key regions associated with cognition in the human cerebellocortical system expand at the highest evolutionary rates, indicating that the system may play a pivotal role in the evolution of human brain functions. It may offer critical clues in the formation of higher order cognitive functions in humans. So this is where, we're thinking about this in terms of evolution, in terms of its current sort of status in the human brain, but with this these evolutionary antecedents. So we can also think about this in terms of clinical studies. So clinical studies have shown that damage to the connections between the cerebellum and cortex during development may lead not only to cerebellar abnormalities, but also impairment of cerebral cortical development, underscoring the importance of cerebellocortical connectivity in early neurodevelopment. So if you damage the connections between cerebellum and cortex, it can lead to abnormalities in the cerebellum because it's not coordinated with the cortex, but also further development of the cerebral cortical, sort of functional linkage. So this is where, they kind of talk about development and how, cognition develops over time. You get, you're born, and then you transition in infancy and you begin to acquire motor skills like rolling, sitting, and standing. You also start to display higher order functions like recognizing familiar faces and objects, using simple gestures, and acquiring speech. And so, this is where you move into the toddler stage. You start to master walking, running, and jumping and throwing, which require coordination, balance, and motor planning. You also experience a wider range of emotions. And then during the preschool years, children further refine these skills and begin to develop fine motor abilities like drawing, as well as higher order cognitive functions such as counting, categorization, language development, storytelling. So you have this sort of these stages of acquiring different sets of skills from infancy to preschool, and those are sort of based on the development of this corticocerebellar system, the coordination of things between the neocortex and the cerebellum. So that's why they're interested in this. Let's see if they have any data that we can look at here. So these are the cortical networks that we're interested in here. These are the primary networks on the higher order networks. So we have the sensory motor network here, we have the auditory network and the visual network, and then we have these higher order networks, which are, let's see, SN is this one here, which is the salience network. You have VAN, which is the ventral attention network. You have, let's see, DMN, which is the default mode network. ECN, which is the executive control network. And the DAN, which is the dorsal attention network. So you see that you have two attention networks, and you have a salience network, and you have default mode, which is DMN, and then ECN, which is executive control. So the DMN is, of course, a default network in the middle, and then the rest. So you can see that there's this wide array of things that are activated in these different networks. You have things in the neocortex, you have things in other parts of the brain, the parietal lobes and things like that. And you have in vision, you have things in the occipital lobe. So yeah, you have all these different types of activation. This is the default mode, of course, where you have activation that's all over the brain. And they give a representation of sensory motor network, and they're looking specifically at the development. So you get this development of the network, as you can tell from fMRI. So there are these activations that are more refined. As you can see here, it's kind of disorganized at 0 to 6 months, and then at 9 to 18 months, there's a little bit more coherence to it, and then at 24 to 60 months, you start to get organization. Sort of modular organization where you get these different parts of the body that are represented. This is the foot, the hand left, the hand right, and the tongue. And you can see that these representations before 6 months are pretty much indistinguishable. Like, they're all over that region of the brain. And then, you have 9 months to 18 months, they start to organize into specific parts of this, specific modules, but they're still kind of disorganized, generally speaking. And then you get to about 60 months and you start to get this high degree of organization, or this high specificity. And so you can see these are the representations here of the foot, the left hand, the right hand, and the tongue. Okay, so and then, this kind of puts it into the anatomical view here. Then these are cerebellar functional flat maps. So these are where we look at the cerebellum, we look at the sort of a flatness of this representation. So this is the cerebellum here, and you have this representation, and then some of the representations of the cerebellum across age in the M&I space. So this is talking about that, and then this is the cerebellar functional flat maps. We have these spatiotemporal patterns of connectivity between the cerebellum and primary networks. So you see how this is all set up between these primary and higher order networks, and there's variation here. And then this is a comparison of parcellation maps between children and adults, where you see a difference between children. Here, this is the representation of 0 to 60 months. For fine, medium, and coarse. So this is where we're looking at this granularity here. And then you have, networks for children and then networks for adults. So you can see differences in how these representations are structured between the children and adults. So there's a lot of data in here, and I'm not going to get into it, but basically it kind of works out a lot of these networks and what it looks like in the cerebellum during development. This
super interesting.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, that's just really interesting. Obviously they're getting this from this excuse me, baby. Is it? Baby Connectome Project.
Oh, okay.
So this is a follow up to the Human Connectome Project.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's focused on, a number of different, number of additional data sets that have been collected. But yeah, really, really interesting to track that. And it's been an area that's been, I don't want to say it's not ignored, it's just, but really interesting to kind of focus on the joint development of that in such a data set.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I like how they link together like the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and then look at the cerebellum as its sort of representations as they're developing from 0 to 60 months. I think that's really insightful.
These are already usually done with ICA in terms of how you get out these networks.
Okay.
Like that's pretty standard. But yeah, they've added this partial correlation analysis with the cerebellum. Yeah. So yeah, again, like really, really interesting, and this is difficult data to get, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I mean, birth at 60 months. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm curious about it'd be interesting to check what the criteria were to be in this study.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because I mean, I'm assuming that these were kids. So it said 35. Like, were these kids that were these kids that needed monitoring regardless?
Yeah.
Like how did that? Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't realize. So this was actually. So Minnesota was kind of one of the original Human Connectome Project sites, but UNC seems to be involved. Like all these authors are UNC, but these all seem to be. Like UNC is involved in this baby connectome.
Okay.
And it's anyway. I'll check what the subject recruitment was.
Okay.
Yeah, like strategies for imaging typically developing children. So without sedation. like how do you ask a newborn, like, okay, hold still.
Yeah.
I mean, you could put some padding in and stuff. Anyway.
Yeah.
That must have been interesting.
So this is a review article that maybe puts a little bit of this into more context. This is the embryonic stages in cerebellar afferent development. So this is from Cerebellum and Ataxis, which is a journal. It's focusing on the cerebellum. So the abstract of this reads, the cerebellum is important for motor control, cognition, and language processing. Afferent and efferent fibers are major components of cerebellar circuitry. An impairment of these circuits causes severe cerebellar malfunction, such as ataxia. The cerebellum receives information from two major afferent types. So there's this exquisite structure of fibers in the cerebellum. The afferent types are these climbing fibers and these mossy fibers. In addition, a third set of afferent projections to the cerebellum is neuromodulatory fibers. So this is projecting to the cerebellum, and this is modulation from from other parts of the brain. And so the afferents are sending a signal to something. So this is where you're sending signals in this climbing fiber and sending a signal in the mossy fiber. And then there are these neuromodulatory fibers. The spatiotemporal pattern of early cerebellar afferents that enter the developing embryonic cerebellum is not fully understood. And then the last paper kind of gives us some information about how these representations look, in development over, different months, time periods. So we see that these representations get refined over that time. So we have this, we want to look at this pattern of early cerebellar afferents to see what is changing in those and how those might affect those representations. So the spatiotemporal pattern of early cerebellar afferents that enter the developing embryonic cerebellum is not fully understood. In this review, we will discuss the cerebellar architecture and connectivity specifically related to afferents during development in different species. So they look beyond humans and actually beyond primates for this. So this is useful in thinking more broadly about the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is conserved, but of course, say, like the expansion of the neocortex in terms of size is not. So in mice, for example, you don't have this. So maybe this affects the way the afferents are structured. We will also consider the order of afferent fiber arrival into the developing cerebellum to establish neural connectivity. So they talk about proper cerebellum function depending on well-organized neuronal connections and the integration of afferent and efferent fibers throughout the cerebellar circuitry. The cerebellum can be divided into two longitudinal regions along the rostral to caudal axis, which are anatomically named the vermis and the hemisphere. So mediolaterally, each of these regions is folded into lobes, lobules, and folia. Traditionally, the cerebellum is divided into 3 lobes that are further subdivided into 10 lobules. Lobule 1 through 10 numbering is used for the lobules of the vermis, and the corresponding lobules of the hemisphere are indicated with the prefix H. Recent studies suggest that the fundamental architecture of the cerebellum is organized into 5 transverse zones based on gene expression and afferent fiber termination. So there's this connection between afferent fiber termination and gene expression patterns, which is, of course, this is going to be important in how these are regulated. And so, we have these different zones. The boundaries of these zones do not align with the lobes and lobules, but do correspond to the pattern of afferent termination and thus provide a more functional and relevant way of dividing the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellar cortex is 3-layered and contains 6 main neuronal cell types: the stellate and basket cells in the molecular layer, the Purkinje cell somata in the Purkinje cell layer, and the granule cells, Golgi cells, and unipolar brush cells in the granule layer. We have 3 layers and these different cell types in each layer. Then, on top of that, we have the afferents and efferents that relay information. Neurons of the cerebellar nuclei are located close to the roof of the 4th ventricle, deep within the cerebellar white matter. Cerebellar nuclei in the lateral vestibular nucleus constitute the sole output for the efferent of the cerebellum. So this is where we're getting the output. Efferents are outputs, afferents are inputs, and so we get this sole output from all these inputs and play a central role in cerebellar circuitry and function. So, the cerebellum is connected not only to the neocortex, but also to the brainstem. And so, let's see. So this, these are the pathways by which the cerebellar afferents and efferents enter and exit. Cerebellar afferents can be grouped into 2 major types: mossy fibers and climbing fibers. So the efferents have like one category, the afferents have multiple categories. Mossy fibers constitute the majority of afferent fibers in the adult cerebellum and arise from multiple sources. And so they just keep going on about the structure of the cerebellum. I don't want to spend a lot of time because it's pretty but you get the idea, it's pretty complex. And so there are a lot of parts of the cerebellum, and it's a pretty complex circuit. And, okay, so what might be more interesting here is sort of the molecular aspects of the cerebellum. So extension and direction of early afferent fibers, axon pioneers to target neurons during development. is controlled by genes and molecules, which mostly play a role in repulsion attraction. Several families of these proteins have been identified, among them 4 well-characterized families, playing an important role in axon guidance and development. So those are efferent EPH, semaphorins, neuropilins, netrin, and roboslit. And of course, roboslit is involved in more general developmental processes. So same as netrin with brain development and efferent EPH. So this is, kind of interesting. We're framing this in the context of, the development of neural systems very generally and developmental biology even more generally. We have different types of molecules important in pioneer axon development, which can provide a substrate that promotes outgrowth of growth cones. In addition, morphogens, initially characterized based on the effects of early patterning, are being increasingly implicated in axon guidance. So again, we have this sort of, if we know anything about reaction diffusion morphogenesis, we know there are these theoretical constructs called morphogens, and they've been mapped to different molecules in development. And these morphogens, of course, are involved in patterning. And there are many different types of morphogens that are implicated in these different functions. And we've been able to link this to axon guidance in the brain in general, but in the cerebellum more specifically. Morphogens found to be essential in cerebellar development include the Wnt family, sonic hedgehog, and bone morphogenetic proteins, or BMPs. So these are the sort of the general candidates for any sort of morphogenetic process, but they play a specific role in cerebellar development. These molecules from cell surfaces and intracellular signaling pathways provide cues that enable growing axons to terminate at their target cells. And so we have different gene families that are involved in regulating different aspects of afferent patterning. So in chicken and mouse embryonic cerebella, we observe the efferent EPH gene family is sort of this molecular pathway that's involved in regulating afferent patterning. And GRAIL2 is important in the development of cerebellum and regulates mossy fiber projections. UNC5, which is actually something from C. elegans, it's a protein that is essential for dorsal guidance of pioneer axons and is important in the development of the rostral cerebellum. So we have this deeply conserved gene UNC5, which actually is, you find this in C. elegans, but it's also found in brains with a cerebellum. It has also been suggested that axonal development in the cerebellum is regulated by a Wnt7a signaling pathway. Furthermore, gene mapping studies have shown that precerebellar nuclei, including inferior olivary nuclei neurons, likely originate from an area expressing PTF1A, OLI3, and Wnt1, and this is from this reference. BRN3 expression has been shown to be necessary for inferior olivary nuclei development, and overall gene expression appears to be conserved across vertebrates as the inferior olivary nuclei of zebrafish. So, this is where we're looking at something that's sort of a protocerebellum, also expresses PTF1A and BRN3A. So we can actually use molecular studies to sort of figure out what's deeply conserved in, say, fish brains or in C. elegans, and how those map to the modern cerebellum in a lot of mammals. What do we have here? Okay, Trevor, thanks for attending. So this is, a nice study that kind of puts this into a better, a deeper context. Basically, we're interested in the evolution of the cerebellum. So the basic organization of afferent and efferent cerebellar connections appears to be conserved throughout evolution. We know a lot about this morphology. They've kind of gone through this in this review. But we can also look at the molecular aspects of this to understand the spatiotemporal pattern of cerebellar afferents and how they share commonalities across mammals, avians, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And of course, not all of these organisms have a cerebellum. I think mammals and avians, if I'm correct on that, maybe reptiles, I know that fish do not, but this is a thing that's deeply conserved, these molecular mechanisms. So it's like maybe it's you have a lot of molecular mechanisms playing these kind of roles in brain morphogenesis, but then you get these specific structures that they get restricted to later and they get specialized. So this is an interesting review, kind of going over this deep evolutionary history and kind of how development operates. Then there's this paper here from Biological Cybernetics. This is a bit broader view on things. This is where we have this development of projections between areas of the nervous system. So this isn't just cerebellum. This isn't just this cerebrocerebellar circuit. This is like the entire, brain, considering the entire brain and the development of projections. So this is talking about a theory of projections in the nervous system, such as the retinotectal projection. So the retinotectal projection is important in the development of vision and the development of mappings between the retina and the tectum, which then brings visual signals into the brain to be processed. Components of axonal growth cones and target tissue interact to cooperate within the area of contact to generate a guiding parameter, in the simplest case, a guiding substance of distribution P. The components which are involved in this production are assumed to have graded distributions with respect to position in the projecting and target area, respectively. So they're looking at this situation where you have, neurons and you have these axons that are being sent out, and you have this target tissue. And the idea is that you have this you establish these connections between the neuron that's projecting this axon out and either another neuron or some target tissue that it's going to synapse onto. So this is where we have these chemical signals that guide this process. And there's always a sort of guiding substance that is involved in this and guiding these growth factors that guide this going different directions. So there's this distribution P of the guiding substance. The components which are involved in this production are assumed to have graded distributions with respect to position in the projecting and target areas, respectively. The distribution P thus produced guides the growth cone in the direction of the maximal slope until the minimum value of P is reached. So it's like this gradient of growth factors that is sort of navigated, and the growth cone is trying to find sort of its target. And so the target is determined by the maximal slope of this growth factor gradient, and then this minimal value of P is reached when the target is reached. In this way, each growth cone can be guided to a position on the target tissue, which depends on the origin of the fiber, in such a manner that a projection results. Adhesive forces could but need not be involved in the guiding mechanism. The slope of P may interfere with an intracellular pattern forming mechanism within the growth cone. Determining the polarity of activation is modeled previously on the basis of autocatalysis and lateral inhibition, and thus the direction of growth. For the generation of a distribution of P leading to a reliable projection. So basically, how do you achieve a reliable projection? You have this distribution of growth factor, this gradient of a growth factor. It's distributed in terms of density across this region. You have a neuron that sends out a growth cone, an axonal growth cone, towards a target. And that target is reached when the distribution is minimized, and you have this steep gradient that leads it to its location. So, the whole point here is to get these reliable projections from a neuron to a target tissue or an axon to another axon, and establish these connections and develop them. So this is a very biophysical model of projections, and the idea is that you have these mechanisms, molecular mechanisms that guide these projections, and then once these projections are established, then they're refined and pruned by different information processing functions in the brain. So this is why this model is important. Sort of the first step in establishing connections. And so The following is an example of this general type of model. Growth cones as well as target tissues contribute to the production of a guiding substance. For each dimension, there is in the target tissue an exponentially graded component exerting two functions. One, it actively produces guiding substance P, and it interacts in an inhibitory fashion, so it's this negative feedback that's happening, with the production of P by a component of the growth cone, which is in turn graded with respect to position of origin in the projecting area. While the theory is proposed as a fair approximation of primary events in neural projections, superimposed regulatory effects can also be incorporated. And so these include fiber-fiber interactions, mechanisms smoothing out unequal density distributions of axon terminals, and effects on time arrival of fibers on the projection, which have been proposed previously as primary mechanisms generating projections. So this is just a model of this sort of establishing connections. And there's a timing here that's important because, if a neuron doesn't connect to something, it tends to die. So you have this axon cone that's sent out. It guides along this gradient. It finds a target. And if it doesn't find a target, then it can't activate itself. It can't be active. It's active, but it doesn't do anything. And so typically those neurons die. And so if there are problems, say, with cell adhesion or other problems, you can have problems establishing that gradient. You can also have problems with a lot of cell death because the neurons die because they're not able to function properly in that matrix. Remember, this is all happening within an extracellular matrix, and so there's this aspect of it as well. Okay, so the last paper is this paper on computational neurodevelopment. And so this is a paper, it's a bioRxiv paper. It talks about infant decision-making in changing environments. So this is backing up even from the anatomy and the molecular aspects of projections and the development, the sort of the morphogenesis of the cerebellum and all of that, to talk about sort of the neurodevelopmental origins of psychiatric conditions. So in the recognition of the fact that most psychiatric conditions have neurodevelopmental origins, there is an increasing interest in applying the methodological and conceptual approaches from computational psychiatry to developmental cohorts. However, the challenge of acquiring and modeling behavioral responses in very young infants has thus far proven difficult to overcome. So, this is a study, unlike the last two, which were sort of a model and a theory respectively, or review and a theoretical model respectively. To address this, we develop a novel gaze contingent cue reversal paradigm, which is an experimental paradigm. It's a novel gaze contingent is, I guess, where they're doing some, So to address this, we developed a novel gaze contingent cue reversal paradigm that allowed 6 to 10-month-old infants to make overt behavioral responses to assess learning of expectations and updating of behavior in response to change. We then fit computational models to infant behavior, and for the first time, we're able to validate the winning model to the same standards as would be expected of adults. So this is where you want to have a good model that can be comparable to adults. And I guess this is, in computational modeling of development, this is very hard to do, especially with infants. Mainly because infant behavior is very different than adult behavior, but also because I guess it's hard to sort of find a similar methodology for it. Similar to prior findings in adults, model-based prediction error measures correlated with post-switch increases in pupil size, consistent with noradrenaline's hypothesized role in learning about change. Data-driven clustering based on model parameters revealed 2 infant behavioral subtypes hidden within the data. One with a preservating profile, and the other with a more exploratory decision-making pattern. So it's kind of like, a conservative approach versus a more exploratory approach. This approach sheds new light on the classic finding that all infants under 12 months tend to preservate. So this is something that we've assumed It's a classic finding that infants under 12 tend to preservate and not explore. So we actually kind of overturned this a bit because this computational model is a little bit more robust than the experimental models that we've done previously. Crucially, there were no significant differences in age between the clusters, but differences in terms of adaptive skills and temperament measured by gold standard developmental assessments. These results prime the field for computational psychiatry, demonstrating that we can reliably fit models to infant data, and that the parameters for such models can identify subgroups with distinct cognitive profiles that are superior to those derived from behavioral data alone. So this is, again, computational psychiatry. This is, kind of an example of this, where they're doing this in infants, and they're comparing the results with adults, and they're finding actually not only that you can do that, but you can also find novel results. So they're, interested in this aspect of the external environment that's constantly changing. So the basic cognitive capacity requires initial learning about statistical regularities, such as that A follows B, so you're trying to figure out some sort of sequence learning or protocausality. Basically, if A follows B, then that's different than B follows A. So this helps us build expectations about the world. However, sometimes the context changes. So sometimes, we have something like A follows B, but we have to reverse that because in some cases, B actually follows A. So sometimes we end up overestimating our ability to sort of, we can identify the statistical regularity, but we can't, identify the context change. And so in this case, we get this prediction error in the service of new learning. So as we try to learn new things, try to learn new context, we get these prediction errors. This is the cornerstone of cognitive flexibility and is fundamental to adaptive behavior. So this highlights the susceptibility of cognitive flexibility to risk factors that lead to adverse outcomes and the importance of studying the emergence of error-driven learning at an early age. So this is, computational psychiatry is really focused on this area of cognitive flexibility, and we have these different studies in different disorders that sort of speak to this. In fact, altered computations of learning under uncertainty have been identified as an important transdiagnostic feature across almost all forms of psychopathology. So this is kind of talking about the neurochemistry of this, where you have noradrenaline, which is this plays a primary role in the system. And you can use proxy measures of pupillometry to look at the activity of noradrenaline. And so noradrenaline is implicated in the encoding of prediction error signaling and signals that a context has changed. These computational signatures of learning are also sensitive to medications that act via adrenergic mechanisms, opening up new potential treatment options. So this is kind of going through the study. This shows kind of the experimental flowchart. So you have the star cue, which is where you take a look at the star cue. You have this auditory cue. You have a decision screen. You have a cartoon animation and a baseline with audio, and you have to determine whether the scene is correct or incorrect. And it's based on being exposed to the star cue and the auditory cue and merging those cues in a different context. Okay, so I think they do, this is a good paper for looking at sort of these behavioral assays in computational psychiatry and neurodevelopment. And then the other papers I think are really key for looking at sort of the cerebellum and the function of the brain in development and how that changes. So I think that's it for today. Hopefully we've learned something here. And I know that Morgan was really excited about the first paper, but hopefully this last paper is also similarly exciting. So thank you for attending, and see you next week.